about sex as a process. So take it away.
Right, thank you, Adrian.
Yeah.
So, I was here, I think I had 9 visits here as a visiting professor. It was absolutely wonderful. So it's really great to be back, actually. What I want to do today is to convince you, if I can get my slides to work, how does that work? There we go. That biological sexes are regions of phenotypic space that organisms pass in and out of one or more times during their lifetime. So the kind of big philosophical claim here is that sexes don't attach to organisms, but only to life history stages of organisms. It's not the case that Paul is male. Paul is, I hope, male at the moment, has been for a while. But that's the ontology is an ontology of life history stages, not of organisms. And I hope to show you this is not a radical proposal. It's simply the clearest way to state the standard biological definition of sex and uncontroversial ideas that we should all accept about evolution and development. So one reason, obvious reason to think that sex is a property of life history stages is that lots of organisms switch sex during their life cycle. It doesn't make any sense to say Gary the groper is a very nice groper that most of us know in Manly, Australia. I'm sure Peter Godfrey Smith has met, probably, you know, Gary's godfather or something, who knows? But anyway, Gary the groper is this huge friendly blue fish. It doesn't make any sense to say Gary the groper is a male. Gary, like every other eastern blue groper, he matured as a sexually reproductively competent female at about 30 centimeters, spent a few years laying eggs, and then when he got to about 50 centimeters, he turned blue, acquired a territory on the reef, and started producing sperm instead of eggs. Okay? So in the case of species with sex switching, it's just obvious that sex is attached to life history stages, not to whole organisms. I also should thank Therese Hayward for these lovely drawings I'll be using of all the species I'm talking about. She's met Gary too. Now, sequential hermaphroditism, which is what we're talking about, is an incredibly common life history strategy. Okay, the great sin of the philosophy of sex and gender is to think that biological sex is a property unique to humans. The moment you start thinking about other species, pretty much everything that people say has massive counterexamples. There's a lot of sequential hermaphroditism. So the eastern blue groper is protigenous. It starts female becomes male, but limpets are protandrous. They start male, and rather they start juvenile, mature as males, and later on become females. And there are good ecological reasons for that. So in life history theory, we predict that organisms will become sexually mature at the optimal size for reproduction. But the optimal size for reproduction often differs between the sexes. So a really sensible strategy is to adopt the sex that fits your size. Okay, it's quite difficult to double yourself in weight, but if you are a particular weight, maturing as one sex rather than another is an option available to you. Different ecologies mean that there are different orders of sex changing that will be advantageous. Okay, we won't go into the details. There are some lovely species. There's an Australian fish, Gravidion histrio, which does bidirectional sex switching. It can just do whatever the circumstances require. Excellent. Okay, so why don't we apply this perspective to humans? And I don't really have time to fully defend this view, but I would argue that it's because we're in the grip of genetic sex essentialism, of the view that sex is defined by sex chromosomes, that a human being is, when they're fertilized, has an XX or an XY chromosome complement, and that makes them male. And I want to convince you that that's wrong. Now, obviously, you can't have a genetic sex essentialist view about biological sexes as a general view about all organisms, because so many organisms don't have genetic sex determination. So this is an Australian saltwater crocodile. They come up to about 6 meters in length. The males are extremely territorial and aggressive. The great Australian eco-feminist Val Plumwood of late and treasured memory was once taken in a death roll by one of these guys, left for dead, shoved under the bank in his meat larder, and had to crawl out, tourniquet her own leg, and crawl several miles to the nearest farm. So very impressive performance. You want to know whether you're dealing with a highly territorial male crocodile, and asking what sex chromosomes they have is not going to do you any good. Okay. So in these cases of environmental sex determination, so saltwater crocodile is male if it's, I forget the exact temperatures, it's somewhere around 32, 33 Celsius, but if the egg is matured between those temperatures, it's male. At either of the two extremes, it's female. Okay? It's one of the two patterns you get in reptiles. So in those cases, it's obvious that calling a newly laid crocodile egg male or female, at best, is making a prediction about how it's going to develop. You're saying, look, it's in the middle of the nest, it's a pretty average year, I reckon it'll come out male. That's all you could mean by saying it was male. If you just, I don't know, some other animal like a goanna, I don't know if they do it with crocodile eggs, some goanna digs the nest up, it might come out as female, okay? So what I want to convince you of is that that's also true of animals with genetic sex determination. That when you say that a newly fertilized human is male, you're just making a prediction about what's likely to happen. You're not actually identifying some property of maleness inherent in that embryo. Okay? A nice way to see that is organisms with facultative genetic sex determination. So this is the Australian three-line skink. It's got an XXXY chromosome system just like ours, but under certain ecological conditions, everybody develops as male irrespective of chromosome complement. So in other words, it's got genetic sex determination with a temperature override system, in fact, in this case. In a cold year, they all develop as males. And we assume that that's a mechanism of adaptive phenotypic plasticity linking sex ratio to environmental conditions, which after all is a common phenomenon predicted by life history theory and seen in many species. Okay, so if we look at facultative genetic sex determination, what that shows us is that genes and temperatures obey causal parity. That'll annoy a few people, all right? There are two ways you can switch on the developmental pathway to maleness or femaleness. One is by kicking it with a gene, and the other is by kicking it with a temperature. And there's no reason to say that that a gene makes you male whether or not it sent you down a male developmental pathway, any more than you should say that a temperature is a male temperature whether or not it sent the crocodile down a particular developmental pathway. Genes are no more essences of maleness and femaleness than temperatures are. Now, there's somebody who very much doesn't believe this, which is Justin Garson and his collaborator, Maximilian Rifkin. And so they have criticized my view that juvenile organisms are only male in the sense of prospective narration prediction. According to them, it's deeply counterintuitive. We all know that little boys are male before they become sexually mature. My view of this is that my view is deeply unintuitive because everybody is wrong. We're all brought up to believe that little boys are essentially male from fertilization, but that's just sex essentialism, and a number of people have written excellent critiques of sex essentialism, including John, in a paper that's now being widely cited by all sorts of young feminist philosophers like a bunch of Sarah Richardson students and so forth, becoming quite a highly cited paper again. So there just isn't an essence of maleness any more than there's an essence of athleticism. When I get a polygenic risk score and say this kid, if put into suitable training programs, will be a great athlete, it does not make the egg athletic, all right? It's a prediction about what will happen under suitable conditions if nothing interferes, okay? And so is when I say that egg is male. Now, you can also, I think it's quite nice to get the symmetry going. So this is not a bad drawing of a transcaucasian male vole. They actually look like that. They're one of quite a large number, actually, of mammalian species that don't have the sex-determining region on the Y. So according to Rifkin and Garson, what makes you male is that you have a genetic region whose proper function is to make you male. You're male by design, okay? My point is that you can take that away and organisms stay male, okay? It's just a switch. And these guys switch on exactly the same developmental pathway using a different switch, exactly the same. It's the mammalian developmental pathway. It's closely homologous to what is happening with me, is happening in the translocated mole doll. And in a lovely paper by Laura Franklin Hall, where she basically gets you to see that one really good way to think about being male, which I'm perfectly happy with, is that if you've developed down a pathway which is homologous to the ancestral animal pathway for developing maleness, you get to be male. I'm totally happy with that. It's just thinking in terms of homology and common descent, which I think is perfectly reasonable. So if your developmental pathway is homologous to that of other males, you get to be male. Much more reasonable view. So Y chromosomes, boring, switches, okay, can be replaced by temperatures. That's nothing could be less like an essence. Okay, so coming back, I want to convince you that sex is a region of phenotypic space that organisms grow into and grow out of, or can grow out of. Okay, so the blue groper, a typical blue groper, starts as a juvenile, grows into a female, and then later on grows into a male. Okay, and these are regions. I've drawn strict lines around them, but of course they don't have strict lines around them. They're fuzzily bounded regions of phenotypic space. You can be close to the center and have prototypically all the prototypical characters of a male, or you can be somewhere in the vagueness zone, not quite sure if you're male or not. It's very important to see that, we'll talk about this in a minute. What I really want to talk about now is, well, hang on, I've drawn these regions and labeled them male and female. I could also, with a different species, I would have had a different region and labeled it hermaphroditic, okay, for simultaneous hermaphrodites. What justifies labeling a region of phenotypic space as male or female? And the answer is simply the absolutely standard biological definition of sexes. So here from Roughgarten's wonderful book, Evolution's Rainbow, to a biologist, male means making small gametes and females means making large gametes, period. And you see Lehtinen in a glossary, this is a glossary entry, anisogamy, a form of sexual reproduction in which the fusing gametes are of markedly unequal size. Okay, so how do we identify regions of phenotypic space as male or female? They're the regions of phenotypic space which implement a reproductive strategy focused on the reproduction of one or both kinds of gametes. Male phenotypes are part of a reproductive strategy focused on the production of sperm. Female phenotypes are part of a reproductive strategy focused on the production of eggs. Hermaphroditic phenotypes are part of a reproductive strategy focused on the simultaneous production of eggs and sperm, like in earthworms. Okay? So in all multicellular sexually reproducing organisms, there are exactly two different types of gamete, different not merely in size, but fundamentally different in structure, such as the sperm and eggs that we're familiar with in us and our related species. Sexes, again, I'm not saying anything radical here, sexes exist only in species that are anisogamous. In isogamous species with equal gametes, we don't talk about sexes. You could say there's one sex or no sex. There's no factual difference between those two things. So, if we think about our groper, in the groper being large, blue, and territorial is a strategy for reproducing with large numbers of small, cheap sperm. Now note, I'm male, I'm not blue, I'm not particularly large, and I don't defend a territory on the reef. What this shows us is that the particular phenotypes that implement a male reproductive strategy can be completely different from one species to another, which is the main point of John's 1986 paper, and something that's pushed by a lot of contemporary philosophers is very important, and of course they're right. So maleness doesn't have a phenotypic essence, let alone a genetic essence. Any way of being that implements a reproductive strategy focused on a particular kind of genetic propagule is a male strategy or a female strategy or a hermaphroditic strategy, depending on what's going on. So it's a really striking fact that all multicellular sexually reproducing organisms are anisogamous. Of course, there are asexually reproducing organisms, that's a different matter, right? But if you're going to do it sexually and you're multicellular, you do it with two fundamentally different kinds of genetic propagules. That is a striking fact about nature. Now, philosophers hate this fact. What they normally do is they try to say, oh, but what about mating types, which are very common in single-cell organisms? And I can explain later in the questions, but I want to know why you just can't. If you identify sexes with mating types, you either have to use two words for the same thing or invent a new word for sexes. Okay, it's a disaster. You can't do it. So I'll talk about that later if you want to. They also point to this. Look, there are some primitively multicellular algae which are kind of not clearly isogamous or anisogamy. See, look, here they are. And to which my response is, okay, here's Archaeopteryx. I still think we can distinguish wings from arms, all right? These are normally taken to be organisms that are models for the transition to multicellularity, which is strongly associated with the transition to anisogamy. So yes, you can find intermediate fossils, and just as in Darwin's day, it doesn't refute evolution. Okay, there are things that are halfway between, and they're things that are sort of, would you want to call this multicellular, or do you want to call it, they're on that boundary. Okay. But I actually think we should just accept the fact that this is a really striking fact about nature, and there is a standard explanation of this, which has been pretty stable. Now, again, you can overstate this. Joan Roughgarden has problems with this explanation, and they're clever problems. But it's far more stable and orthodox than any explanation we have of the evolution of sexual reproduction, right? Once you've got sexual reproduction, there's a pretty strong consensus on why you get anisogamy, and it's been around since the 70s. Don't have time to go into the details. It's a big theoretical modeling tradition and so on, okay? Basically, it's just, if you have selection, if you have a demand for high levels of provisioning in the zygote, which you're going to get if you're a multicellular organism, right? You can't start your lifestyle without some provisioning if you're multicellular. Then if there's variation in gamete size, organisms get driven to either fully provisioning the zygote or not provisioning it at all. The strategy of saying, I'm going to give my gamete enough provisions that if it's lucky and meets somebody else carrying some provisions, it'll be viable, is a losing strategy. You either fully provision it so it can meet something with no provisions and still survive, or you don't provision it at all. It's a very stable result. All the, we can talk about Levins and robustness and all that if we want to, okay? So we kind of know why this is. So, and it's a striking fact about nature with a great explanation. Just accept it, all right? Okay. So why does nobody want to accept it? Philosophers and gender theorists feel they must reject the anisogamy biological definition of sex because of the sex binary. Be scared, be very scared. The sex binary will get you. All right, so what is the sex binary? Well, the phrase is ambiguous between two different things, and that's the problem. First thing, anisogamous reproduction involves combining two fundamentally different kinds of gamete, e.g. sperm and eggs, to make a new genetic individual. This is true. Two, every organism is either male or female. This is false. How do we know it's false? Well, that's a really amazing area, which I'm really enjoying writing about. One reason it's obviously false is that if we look at those two groper, one of them turns into the other one, and it doesn't happen like that, okay? So if you've got a groper that's transitioning from female to male, it has indeterminate sex. It's very hard to deny that. I mean, I'm sure there could be there's some set theorist out there who'll take all the cells and put them into set theory and show that there's like one Sorites moment when it's before that's essentially female, that's actually no, but that's just bullshit, right? So we all know that in fact, there's an indeterminate phase when the fish is neither male nor female, okay? And that's right. So what does anisogamy imply? Does anisogamy imply that every organism is either male or female? Obviously not. Making eggs is the property. Does every organism either make eggs or make sperm? No. Okay? So anisogamy implies that every organism is either male, female, both, neither, or indeterminate. Okay? Calling that view the sex binary is, in my view, reckless. It is deliberately trying to fuzz up these two ideas so that you can make some philosophical excitement. Anisogamy does not imply a binary view of sex. It implies a binary view of gametes. And I'm prepared to argue that gametes are binary in multicellular organisms, with a few exceptions in complex algae. Okay. So let's just forget about this, accept anisogamy as a definition of sex, and see where it takes us. Now, anti-essentialism about sex, in my view, is an excellent view we should all adopt. John, just 40 years ago, John told us we should adopt it. We should, have listened by now, you'd think. Anti-essentialism, yes. And John argues for anti-essentialism by just documenting the fact that there just really aren't any properties. Whenever you find something you think, oh, that's typically male, you just need to look at more species, okay, and it'll go away. And he's right about that. And so, there are no sexual essences. So, for example, I mean, it's not exactly wrong, but there's a paper by Muhammad Ali Khalidi where he argues that biological sexes are natural kinds because they're homeostatic property clusters. But, if they are homeostatic property clusters, they're weak disjunctive property clusters. And I'm not sure that a weak disjunctive property cluster really is a property cluster. So, either these ones cluster or those ones, and not very strongly. I don't think that's really, yeah, all right. You can call it a property cluster if you want, but it's not really what anybody really means. And of course, bunch of philosophers, Aya Evron, Aya Watkins, Marina DeMarco, have very powerfully critiqued that view by saying, property cluster my ass, basically, right? There is no cluster of male properties and female properties. It's just not true. And John made that point a long time ago, and he's given due credit for that in the literature. The trouble is that recent authors turn that into an argument for eliminativism. The view is, if there are no essential properties of maleness and femaleness, then there are no sexes, is the claim. And it's normally done by taking John's point about little explanatory power. There are few significant laws relating males and females in general, from which we move to the conclusion, oh, well, sexes are not really of any scientific interest. We should eliminate them from our ontology. Let me explain to you why that is deeply, deeply mistaken. So evolutionary theory does not involve laws of nature. Evolutionary theory does not give you laws that tell you whenever this is present, that will be present. Okay? Evolution is a complex, dynamic process in which many variables interact. It's a population level process, which often its dynamics give you multiple possible outcomes from a single initial configuration. Okay? But you can model that process. You can be quite good at understanding and modeling it. So we don't want laws of nature that say, if you produce small gametes, you will be blue. There aren't going to be any laws like that. John showed us that 40 years ago. Instead, there will be models in which whether you produce large or small gametes is an important variable. And the question to ask is not, if I only know that you produce small gametes, how much can I predict about you? Because the answer will be nothing. What we want to know is, if I'm trying to predict what you'll be like, and I drop out of the model whether you produce large or small gametes, will I lose a lot of predictive power? To which the answer is, hell you will, okay? There's Gary the groper and Ginny the groper, and they're really different, and you're refusing to look at the variable that explains that difference in outcomes. So evolution, one of the nice things is, so for example, let's take sequential hermaphroditism. When you model sequential hermaphroditism, you've got to put in all these other variables like territoriality, the relationship between egg survival and egg productivity. So you build a big model which tells you what kinds of hermaphrodism will be most advantageous for your species, okay? And then you plug the whole thing into life history theory. And the same set of models are going to explain why the groper is protogynous and why the pink skunk clownfish is protandrous. So we've got opposite outcomes, and we're understanding both of them using the same class of models, and sex is an important variable in explaining opposite outcomes when the other variables change. We should not be surprised by this. In any other area of philosophy of science, the view that a variable has no explanatory role unless it's completely insensitive to the setting of all the other variables would be laughed out of the room, okay? And it only gets in here again because, honestly, I think people are just there's got to be some way of showing that biology is the problem rather than society. Okay, I think society is the problem, not biology. All right. So to conclude, the best way to think about sex is as regions of phenotypic space that organisms pass in and out of one or more times during their lifetimes. It's not the organism as a whole that is male or female, but a stage in that organism's life. A whole organism doesn't have a sex. It has a sexual life history strategy. So let's just stick to fish so it doesn't get too complicated. So in fish, there are 6 known sexual life history strategies. There's simple male, where you start juvenile, become male, die. There's simple female, start juvenile, become female, die. There's simultaneous hermaphroditism, like in the mangrove rivulet. So you start juvenile, you become male and female, and if things go really bad, you just fertilize yourself and get on with it. So there's a facultatively self-fertilizing, simultaneously hermaphroditic fish. It's really cool. Then there's sequential hermaphroditism, which is really common. There's protandrous sequential hermaphroditism, protogynous sequential hermaphroditism, and bidirectional sequential hermaphroditism. So just in fish, we've got 6 known, highly functional sexual life history strategies, which are the right way to be under different ecological conditions for different species. Okay? So if you want to talk about what sex is that fish, the answer is going to be something like bidirectional sequential hermaphrodite, not male or female. Okay, simple sex is male, female, hermaphrodite. Don't attach to organisms, they're attached to life cycle stages of organisms. And I just don't think I'm saying anything radical or philosophical. I think I'm trying to clearly express what you read in the literature on the development and evolution of sexes. I don't see why any of this is adding anything to what I read in the literature. Okay, it's putting it into a process language. That's the most philosophical thing I'm doing, is putting it into a process language. Okay, now every individual organism's life is a trajectory through phenotypic space. So I've shown the top dotted line there is the stereotypical life history of an eastern blue groper. The middle dotted line is an eastern blue groper that dies before reaching 50 centimeters in length. Maybe it gets, there was somebody hit one of these things with a spear gun in Sydney recently and almost got lynched before they got off the beach. People are very fond of eastern blue groper, but it does happen. So you got spear gunned by some idiot, and that's where you finished up. Now, what about that bottom line? That, for example, might be a fish that's exposed to hormone-mimicking chemicals from decaying plastic waste. Okay, so it develops as a juvenile, and it has a long, happy life, but it never enters the region of phenotypic space that represents a sex. Okay. My point is that that fish, there's nothing exciting to be said about that fish. Okay, it just is what it is. That's its life cycle. From the point of view of an individual fish, the fact that its life cycle doesn't represent the implementation of an evolved life history strategy is neither here nor there. It matters to the evolutionary biologist, it doesn't matter to the fish. Okay? Now, that sort of thing happens, of course, all the time in humans. So X0 individuals might be a similar example. If you're an X0 individual, I have some very good friends who are X0 individuals, you might be, you'll probably be classified as female gender, at birth, okay? But if you look at your actual life your trajectory through phenotypic space, it's very different from the more common trajectory in which organisms start juvenile, become female, and then go into the uniquely human life history stage of menopause, okay? So you don't do juvenile reproductive female menopause as your life history strategy, okay? And again, my view is that that just is what it is. From the point of view of the individual, from the point of view of medicine, the fact that that developmental trajectory does not implement an evolved life history strategy is of no great concern. I mean, if somebody says to me, you're treating my cancer and you're X0, is it of any interest to you that whether, I'm designed to do that or if it's an accident due to the machinery of, crossing over? No, which one is it? It's goodness sake, anyway, spindle formation or something like that goes wrong. Forgotten exactly the details. It doesn't matter to me as a doctor. I suggest you are what you are, and I get on and I treat you. Now, according to Rifkin and Garson, we should ask, what is an organism? What sex is an organism designed to be? And it seems to me that that's a question of very little interest. We should take organisms for what they are. And if the phenotypic facts that confront us make it difficult to apply our categories of biological sex, we should just accept what the biology is telling us. Lots of individuals don't have a clear or determinate biological sex, and that's not a problem. Okay, so I'd like to thank my group, which has now been taken over by Pierrick Barat and run by Pierrick, although I'm still a member of it at Theory and Methods in Bioscience Group. There's a version of this on Phil Papers. This is really just an application of the view of human nature that Carola and Stotz and I developed in one of our last joint publications. And special thanks to Therese Hayward for all those lovely pictures of the species I wanted to talk about.